Hey there, how's it going? And so today I want to show you how we can use custom bullet points in Squarespace both 7.1 and 7.0 without having to use HTML. Now I want to show you how to use them not only for text blocks but also for image blocks, and specifically for image blocks in 7.0 where we don't really have the ability to create bullet pointed lists inside the subtitle area. This is a question that I've gotten a couple of times inside the club, so today I want to share with you how we can make all of this happen so that you can apply it for your client project. So if you want to know how to make this happen, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm going to start out with 7.1 over here, and here I have a bullet point list inside a regular text block. So let's go ahead and take a look at how these original bullet points are set up to see how we can substitute them for a different image that we want to use. So if we take a look here inside the inspect element tool, we can see that in here we're standing over a P element that is sitting inside an LI element. So each of these LI elements that you see in here are each of the list items that we have inside this bullet pointed list. And so inside each of those LI elements, we have a P element. And inside each P element, we have the text that corresponds to that list item. And we also have here a before. So this before that we have in here is actually the bullet point that we have for unordered lists inside Squarespace. So in order to substitute this, basically what we can do is reuse the same selector that Squarespace was using to be able to add this bullet point in the first place, and then change a couple of things in there to be able to add our own image. So if we take a look here on the right side, you're going to see that at the top portion here of the screen, we have this content property. So inside the content property is where we have the bullet point code that we can use in CSS to be able to make it show up on the screen. So you can see that if I send over it, we have a little bubble that shows up that is giving us that bullet point that is currently showing up on our website. So to be able to bring up our custom bullet point, we need to substitute this for something else. So the way that we're going to do this is by reusing the same selector that Squarespace has over here. This is going to be the easiest way to be able to change this up without too much issues. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that, and I'm going to paste it in here inside my custom CSS window. Now, if I use this snippet the way that it is, or this selector the way that it is right now, I'm going to make this change globally across the entire site because there's nothing really specific here about which block I'm targeting. So if this is something that you want to apply for just one section of the site or one block of the site or even one whole page, then what you can do is just add something else to the selector to be able to make it more specific. Now, if this is something that I would want to do, what I can do is just grab, for example, the block ID of this whole text that I have in here, because I just have one bullet point in there and that's the one that I want to modify. So if I were to look for the block ID of this whole text block that I have in here, I can go ahead and grab that, and then that would go before the selector that I have over here because the rest of the selector corresponds to things that are inside this block. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that block ID here. And then if I create my selector this way, or if I modify the selector in this way, what's going to happen is that if I make any modifications to this bullet point now, it's only going to change for this specific block and nowhere else on the site. Now, I don't want to be this specific. I actually want to modify all bullet pointed lists on the site. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove that block ID from there. All right, so now let's go ahead and bring in our own custom image. So the way that I would suggest going about this is to actually use a background image inside the pseudo element. So the before that we're targeting right now. And the reason why I would do it this way instead of just substituting that content property is because if we use a background image, it's going to be a lot easier to be able to resize it and position it exactly the way that we want it to show. So the first thing that we're going to do here is target that content property that we had before, and instead of leaving that code for the bullet point that was currently showing, what we're going to do is just leave here an empty container. So the way that we're going to do that is just by having two quotes without anything inside them. So you can see that automatically as soon as I do that, now we don't have the bullet point showing on the website. So the next thing that we're going to do in here is give this empty container that we're creating a height and a width so that we can then bring in the background image inside that container that we're creating. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a height of, I don't know, let's say maybe like 15 pixels, and then a width of about 15 pixels as well. So I'm going to add a quick background color over here just to make sure that we're seeing what's happening on the screen. So right now it looks like we have a rectangle with shouldn't be there because that's not really the size that we're using. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what is happening, why this is so stretched out. So if we go into that pseudo element again, and then we check a couple of the properties that we have on the right side up here. So everything that you can see on the right side here is being applied to this element that we're highlighting at the moment. And so here you can see, oh, there we go. We have a minimum width applied. This is just something that Squarespace applied originally. So this is what's making this box look so wide, because it's setting a min width of 40 pixels. That is way too big for how I want this bullet point to look like. So I'm just going to go ahead and modify that. So I'm going to give here a min width of 0. And so that way now we have that 15 by 15 pixel container created in there. Now let's go ahead and give this a little bit of a space in between, like the edge of where that red square ends and then where the start of the text begins. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that with, I think a margin would be a good idea. So margin right, let's just go ahead and do maybe like 10 pixels. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Now, of course, I think that's going to be a little bit too tiny for the background image that I want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. Let's choose something like 25. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then let's just go ahead and use a vertical align here to make sure that the text and the square are aligned through the middle. Now, the reason why I can actually use vertical align in here is because I already saw that this before element here, or pseudo element, is already set to inline block. So if it's not set to inline block, you are not really going to be able to use vertical align. But in this case, that's already in place. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply that property, vertical align middle. So once I do that, you're going to see how everything is now a little bit more aligned through the middle. There is a slight difference there, but I think when we bring in the image, that's not really going to be visible. So I'm going to leave it this way for now. All right, so now let's go ahead and bring in the actual image that I want to use in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add up here the background image property, and I'm going to set a URL for this. So I already uploaded the image that I want to use. Is this little batch that I found in iconfinder.com. So I'm just going to go ahead and click over there. Of course, I didn't click inside the parenthesis. I'm just going to go ahead and modify that. Okay, cool. So once I do that, you're going to see how now the image is kind of showing in here inside our little square. So next, what we need to do is basically resize that image so that we can make sure that it fits inside that little space that we created for it. So the first thing that we can do here, I'm going to go ahead and center this first. So if I do that, you can see how now we see like another part of that little image. And then let's just go ahead and do here a background size. We can do here contain, just to make sure that the image is contained within the boundaries of that little square that we created for it. And then the last thing that I want to do in here is use a background repeat and set this to repeat, no repeat, sorry. So this is just to make sure that I don't really have a pattern of images in there, just in case you want to use like a different background size, you want to use a specific pixel size or anything like that. Just to make sure that if you resize that and make it a little bit smaller than the whole container, you don't really see multiple images in there and just one. All right, so now that we have this in place, I think we can get rid of the background color. And then you can see how now, instead of having the regular bullet points, we actually have a lovely little badge showing there as the bullet point for this list. All right, and now let's go ahead and take a quick look at what this looks like on mobile here. Perfect, everything looks great. We have all of the bullet points in there. Everything is positioned the way it should be positioned, because basically all we're doing is modifying what that bullet point looks like. We're not really changing a lot of stuff about it. So the rest of the styles that were there in place before are still there. So that's great. All right, so now let's go ahead and take a look at an image block bullet point list that I already have on this page. So if I scroll all the way down here, you're going to see how now inside this other bullet pointed list, I also have replaced the original bullet points with this same bullet point that I have here. And now this is something that you can do in 7.1, because in 7.1, the bullet point list that we have inside image blocks is the same type of bullet points that we have for regular text blocks. So you can see me that the same snippet that I have in here is altering both things. So this is why I wanted to apply this code across the entire website and not just make this specific for one particular block. Now, again, if this is something that you want to make specific for maybe just one image block, one text block, one page, one section, whatever it is, what you can do is just grab that block ID, data section ID, page ID, whatever it is, and then include that inside the selector that we have in here to make things a little bit more specific. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how this works out in 7.0. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab this whole code that I have in here and move on to my 7.0 side. So here I have a similar bullet pointed list here at the top inside a text block. And then down here, I have an image block that you can see I have a couple of elements that should be inside a bullet point list. But again, we don't really have the ability to create that right off the bat in 7.0. So you can see that if I go in here and try to edit this list that we have in here, oops. And if I try to edit all of this stuff that I have in here, we don't really get the option to create a bullet point list the same way that we have in 7.1. So it's a little bit annoying, but again, I want to show you a workaround for this. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And then if I implement the same code that I had before, if I just paste that in here, you're going to see how the text block that we have up here gets modified. And now we have this little badge bullet point inside here replacing the original one. Now, of course, if we scroll down to the image block that we have down here, nothing is really happening, basically because we don't really have a bullet point list available to be able to create in here inside the image block. So this means that if we want to make this happen, we need to create it ourselves. So I want to show you a workaround that you can use that's going to be somewhat user-friendly, especially if you're going to be allowing your client to be able to modify the content that you have in there and maybe create even additional bullet point items. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we need to have in place before we can create that bullet point list. So if we take a look at the structure that we have here at the moment, let me move this to the side. We're going to see that inside this subtitle container, you can see here that's called image subtitle. So this is the whole, again, subtitle area that we'll have inside the image block. And just in case, this is something that you can apply for any type of image block that you may have. I'm just working with the collage block at the moment. So here we have, again, the image subtitle sort of container that's holding all of the text that we have here underneath the heading. Now, what we can see here is that each of the different sort of phrases or lines that we have in here are separate P elements. So depending on how you want to have the content showed up in here, things can be fairly simple or a little bit more complicated. So let's say that, for example, we want to keep this first line that we have in here without any sort of bullet point, but we do want to create a list for the rest of the elements that we have in here. So one way that we can separate this is by targeting everything else that is not the first element that we have in here, that it's not the first P element that we have in here. So if we wanted to do it that way, we can use something like the not selector, which is going to help us create a little exception so that we can target everything else, all of the P elements that we have in this list, except the first one. So that will be one way to sort of make sure that the first thing, the first line that we have in there doesn't really get modified. The problem here is that what happens if you want to add more text at the top, like before the bullet point list? Like, how are you going to target that? Like, it can get a little bit more complicated because then you need to decide, like, okay, so I want the bullet point to start from the third paragraph text or the fourth paragraph text. And again, if this is something that your client is supposed to be able to handle on their own, then it can become a little bit complicated because that means that either they need to go back into the code to change a couple of things if they add more text in there that they don't want to turn into bullet points, or they need to call you to be able to make that change. So I'm going to show you a different way that we can set things up so that it's a little bit easier. So basically what we need to do here, or the way that we need to look at this, is we need to find a way to separate the P elements that we want to have inside a bullet point list from the ones that we don't want to have inside the bullet point list. So the way to do this is by basically wrapping these little elements that we have in here, or all of these elements that we have here, in a different different pair of tags that is going to help us differentiate that from the first P element that we have in here. So one way that we can do that without having to write any HTML or anything like that is by basically just grabbing those elements that we want to turn into a bullet point list and either making them bold or making them italics. Now, one quick note about this workaround, this is going to limit a couple of things that you can do in terms of style for the bullet points, so it's just something to consider. But again, if you really want to have bullet points in image blocks in 7.0, this is sort of the easiest way to make that happen. So I'm going to go ahead and make the text that I want to have inside bullet points bold. And once I do that, let's just save this real quick. And then if we take a look inside the inspect element tool again, what's going to happen is that now we have all of these P elements again. So everything is still a P element. But inside the ones where we have that bold style applied, we have the text inside a different pair of tags. So we have this text inside strong tags inside P elements. So this is just going to help us sort of mark the text that we want to style differently so that our browser can easily find it and apply that bullet point that we want to create for them. So now that we have all of these things inside strong tags, what we can do is use something similar to what Squarespace is doing in terms of how they are applying bullet points and basically attaching a before to these strong tags. So let's go ahead and see what this would look like. So again, my target container, or my target element, the thing that I want to attach that bullet point to is the strong tag. All right. So what I'm going to do is use here the strong element type. This is going to be the tag, the way that I'm going to be targeting that element there with this element type selector. And then I'm going to go ahead and apply the before to them. So this is how I'm going to attach, again, that bullet point to this strong element. Now, of course, if I do it this way, this is way too generic. So anything that has a bold style applied across the website is going to get that bullet point, and that's not the idea. So I want to make things more specific to this image block. So the way that I can do that is by basically looking for another class that's going to help me point to my browser where these strong tags or where this bolded text is located. So we already saw that all of these P elements and of course the strong tags inside them are sitting inside this image subtitle container. So I can go ahead and grab that class that I have in here and place that inside my selector to be able to make things a little bit more specific. So now basically what this is going to do is look for anything, any bolded text that we have inside an image subtitle container, and then it's going to apply the pseudo element to them. Now, of course, this is still a little bit too generic. So if you were to have more image blocks inside the page, regardless of the type that you're using, this code is still going to apply to them. So if we wanted to make things a little bit more specific to this type of block that we're working with, what we can do is look for one of the specific classes that belongs to different type of image blocks that we have in Squarespace. So for example, in this case, let me just take a look here from where we're starting off. So again, we're starting with the strong tag here that we have inside the P elements. And then what we're doing is grabbing this class of image subtitle, again, to make sure that we're targeting the bolded text inside the image subtitle area. Now, if we want to make things specific for this type of block, we can go ahead and keep looking through all of the different containers that make part of the whole block to see if we can find a class that is going to tell us that we're looking for the collage block or that we're working with the collage block. So if I keep looking here through all of the different containers, you're going to see that at some point I'm going to reach this one that has a couple of classes, and one of them is called Design Layout Collage. So for all image blocks inside Squarespace, at least at the time of this recording, you're going to find a specific class that is particular for that type of block that you're using. So for the poster block, it's going to be something like Design Layout Poster. For the inline block, the one that doesn't really have anything specific to it, that's going to be Design Layout Inline, and so on and so forth. So depending on the type of block that you're using and depending on how specific you want things to go, you can go ahead and grab that class and apply it inside your selector to make sure that only the bold text inside that specific block inside the image subtitle area gets modified. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that Design Layout Collage class that we see in here, and I'm going to place that at the beginning of my selector. So again, I'm targeting the strong tags that we have, or the bolded text that we have inside the image subtitle container that corresponds to the design layout collage image block. So now things are a lot more specific, and it means that if I have any other collage block on the site that has bolded text inside the image subtitle, that's also going to get a bullet point. If not, then nothing is really going to happen. All right, so now that we have things a lot more specific, and you can see how the process is very different from what we had before. But now that we have everything located and pointed to, let's go ahead and start adding our bullet point. So the first thing that we need to do here is add the content property. And this is going to be, again, very similar to what we did before, but again, you can see how the selector is a little bit different. All right, so now that we have the content value there, we're going to be creating that empty container. So we need to give it a height and a width depending on how big we want that image to be. So let's just go ahead and do here height. What did we use before? 25 pixels. All right, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna make it match in size. I want to make it the same size here. And now let's just go ahead and bring in a background color here to see what we're doing. All right, so you can see how right now nothing is really happening. And that is because when you're working with pseudo elements, you need to have a display value applied. So if you're using something like position absolute, the display value is going to be applied pretty much by default. But if we're not using position absolute, which is this situation here, we need to apply a display value of our own. So in this case, because I want things to stay side by side, I'm going to use display inline block. So let's just go ahead and apply that in here, inline block. And then once I do that, you're going to see how the little square shows up in there and is sitting side by side next to the text. Now let's go ahead and add a little bit of a space in between those two things. So before we use 10 pixels, let's do the same thing. Margin right 10 pixels. All right, and then let's go ahead and try to align things vertically. So I'm going to go ahead and use here vertical align middle, and again I'm able to use this property with any of the values available because I'm using an inline block element. So if I were using something like a block level element, I can't really use that property. It's not going to do anything. All right, so now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and bring in our image. So I'm just going to go ahead, you know what, I'm going to copy the same thing as before because I wanted to be the same way. So I'm going to grab the background image URL. So I want to use the exact same image, and then the background position, background repeat, background size. I want all of that to be exactly the same. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that, and I'm going to paste it up here. And once I do that, we have the same result as before. We have our little image sitting there inside our empty container. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and remove that background color because it doesn't match at all. Now let's go ahead and take care of the bolded text that we have in here, because I'm assuming that you don't want those list items to actually show up bold. So let's go ahead and target those. So basically the way that we can do this is by targeting the strong tags in there. So we're targeting the text that is bold inside the image subtitle container, so this content container that we have in here, and then these are going to be targeted only inside the collage image box. So with this in place, basically what we need to do is just set the font weight to normal or whichever other font weight you were originally working with, and now you can see how we don't really have that bolded text showing up anymore. It's still there inside the HTML, but it's not really visible on the website. And with that out of the way, we can go ahead and enjoy how our bullet pointed list looks like inside image blocks in 7.0. All right, and that's it. That's everything that I have for you today. I really hope that you found this helpful. If you have any suggestions for future content, go ahead and leave them below, and I'll see you next time.